So the life of a medieval archer sounds like a dream, right? Just pull back a bowstring, let fly some arrows, and be the hero of the battlefield. Well, think again. Being a medieval archer was closer to a lifelong brutal workout, mixed with constant pain and the ever-looming threat of death. From the moment they were kids, these warriors were forced into a relentless training regimen that turned their bodies into hardened weapons, or twisted statues of calluses and bone deformities. And that's before even facing the horrors of medieval warfare. Imagine having to shoot 10 to 12 arrows every single minute for hours on end, your bow weighing as much as a small child, and your fingers so tough you could probably poke through steel. Yet all this wasn't for glory or fame. Most medieval archers earned an almost pauper's wage and were at the mercy of brutal campaign conditions. But despite it all, these archers decided the fate of kingdoms with volleys of arrows that rained death on knights and armies alike. Today, you'll discover how they trained, fought, and survived, or didn't, this merciless life. Ready your quiver and brace yourself. Let's dive into the crazy, bloody world of medieval archery. Medieval archery didn't start on the battlefield. It started long before with sheer, unrelenting practice from childhood. Historians believe boys began learning to shoot bows from as early as 7 years old, often mandated by law. In England, for example, the Assize of Arms of 1252 and later statutes forced commoners to own bows and practice regularly. This created a culture where archery was woven into everyday life. Village archery butts were common sights, with fathers dragging their sons to practice for hours. Yet it wasn't a gentle introduction. Archers trained with small lighter bows as kids, but graduated quickly to heavy war bows, the dreaded longbow. These weapons had draw weights between 120 and 160 pounds, far surpassing most modern bows. To put that in perspective, imagine pulling a bowstring with the force of lifting a medium-sized dog. This daily punishment meant their muscles and bones adapted monstrously over years of practice. The effects were brutal. Many archers developed enlarged and thickened bones in their arms and shoulders, with fingers carved into tough calluses resembling claws. Some medieval accounts describe fingers so tough that an arrow could barely pierce them. This physical conditioning was necessary. Shooting a longbow repeatedly required precise muscle control as well as raw strength. An English bishop named Hugh Latimer, writing in the late 15th century, recalled how archery practice was part of boyhood culture, but also a regiment that readied one for the bloody realities ahead. This wasn't mere target shooting. Archers trained for long volleys of fire, building endurance to release dozens of arrows over grueling hours, all while under threat of attack. Training wasn't just physical either. Technique was drilled constantly. The Mediterranean draw, anchoring the bowstring near the mouth's corner, was critical for consistent power and accuracy. Archers learned to use chest and back muscles rather than just arms, allowing for faster, stronger shots. Beyond strength and technique, archers prepared for battlefield realities. Protective gear like braces on the forearms and finger tabs shielded them from string burns and assaults on vulnerable hands. Their arrows also came expertly crafted, from bodkin points capable of piercing armor to broadheads designed for maximum flesh damage. This rigorous, tormenting lifestyle of training forged few heroes, but many survivors, who became the deadliest ranged force of the medieval era. To a medieval archer, practice was torture, strength was survival, and every arrow shot was a step closer to a gruesome battlefield. Once the grueling training forged them into deadly weapons of war, medieval archers didn't get to rest on their laurels. Their everyday life, whether in camp or marching to battle, was anything but glamorous or easy. If you thought the battlefield was the worst part, think again. The life of an archer was a non-stop grind of physical exhaustion, poor pay, awful conditions, and constant danger. A typical day for a professional archer began before sunrise, often in a damp, crowded camp with little shelter. Dirt floors, smoky fires, and whatever clothes they had, usually rough wool and linen, were the norm. Their armor was minimal, typically a padded gambeson or leather jerkins that offered some protection, but nothing like the heavy plate worn by knights. Protection came mainly from mobility and distance. Breakfast was a meager affair: hard bread, pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew, and ale or watered-down beer if lucky. Protein was almost non-existent beyond the occasional beans or peas. Food quality and quantity depended heavily on what the army could forage or carry, which meant archers often entered battle hungry and fatigued. Then came the daily grind of maintaining weapons and training, even on the march. Arrows were precious, carefully counted and stored. Bows needed constant care. Bowstrings had to be waxed and kept dry or they snapped. A broken bow in battle could be a death sentence. Archers carried multiple quivers, each packed with meticulously crafted arrows suited for different targets, armor-piercing bodkins and broadhead blades for flesh wounds. Beyond weapon upkeep, archers had to endure exhausting marches. Covering 20 to 30 miles a day, often through muddy fields or rough terrain, while carrying 60 to 80 pounds of gear, was brutal. That weight included bows, arrows, a dagger for close combat, which was mostly a formality and often useless against armored knights, basic food rations, and personal items. Marching was often under rain, freezing cold, or blistering heat, with little rest or shelter. Sleep was another luxury. Most archers had no tents or cots and slept on the ground wrapped in cloaks and whatever scraps kept out the cold and bugs. Dampness and exposure led to illness, and the harsh living conditions caused many to suffer from chronic pain and infections even before the battle began. When battle finally arrived, archers were at the front line of ranged warfare, but were poorly equipped for hand-to-hand combat. Unlike heavily armored knights trained in close quarters, archers were vulnerable once the enemy closed distance. Some carried wooden mallets or small axes, but these weapons offered little chance against sword-wielding armored foes. Financially, it was no better. Skilled archers on campaign earned about 6 pence per day, roughly double the pay of a common laborer, but still meager considering the constant risk of injury or death. Worse, payments were notoriously unreliable. Armies often ran out of funds, delaying wages for weeks or months, forcing archers to loot battlefields or local villages to survive. Officially frowned upon but tolerated, looting became an economic necessity. Even off-campaign, archers faced insecurity. They were expected to maintain their skills and equipment without steady pay, and often worked seasonal agricultural jobs or trades to survive. Injuries were common and medical care scarce. Amputations or disabling wounds typically left them impoverished, reliant on charity or family. Despite all this, medieval archers were respected and feared for their deadly skill. Their resilience to physical hardship and battle trauma made them crucial in wars like the 100 Years' War. But the truth remains, being a medieval archer was a relentless, grueling lifestyle with constant suffering. No glamour, just raw survival against brutality every day. If you think arrows were just harmless little sticks, think again. The weapons in the hands of medieval archers were among the most terrifying killing tools of the age. Picture this: a storm of sharp projectiles hurtling through the air like deadly rain, capable of shredding armor and breaking the morale of the most heavily armored knights. One of the most striking aspects of medieval archery was the rapid firing rate. Expert longbowmen could launch between 10 and 12 arrows per minute, meaning dozens of arrows could swarm an enemy in minutes. This volume of fire allowed archers to cover large sections of the battlefield with deadly volleys, forcing knights and infantry into disarray long before they could reach melee range. The arrows themselves were engineered for maximum damage. Many used bodkin points, slender, hardened steel tips designed specifically to pierce the thick chainmail, and even some plate armor of the time. Other arrows had broadhead tips with razor-sharp edges, crafted to inflict devastating flesh wounds and cause massive bleeding. At distances often exceeding 180 meters, nearly 200 yards, archers could rain down arrows on enemy ranks with deadly precision. This deadly barrage was especially effective against cavalry charges, where horses and riders could be felled en masse. The mere sight of a sky darkened by arrows was enough to instill terror and hesitation into an attacking force. Some of the most famous uses of this ranged terror include the legendary Battle of Agincourt in 1415. There, English longbowmen unleashed a terrifying barrage against the heavily armored French knights, whose heavily armored horses and riders were slaughtered or incapacitated before engaging in close combat. The muddy terrain further trapped the French cavalry in a deadly kill zone of arrows and foot soldiers. The result? A catastrophic defeat for the French and a stunning victory for an outnumbered English force. Across the Iberian Peninsula, the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385 saw a similar tactical effect. Here, roughly 200 English archers fought alongside Portuguese troops, unleashing relentless arrow volleys on the invading Franco-Castilian forces. Positioned in the front-line right wing, these seasoned archers used their deadly longbows to break charge after charge, sowing chaos among the enemy and contributing decisively to Portuguese victory. Their role was crucial, combining raw arrow power with expert tactical deployment, a clear demonstration of how archers shaped medieval warfare beyond England. Archers also used clever tactics to maximize their effectiveness. Defensive stakes and trenches were placed in front of them to protect against cavalry charges. Their firing lines were coordinated to maintain continuous barrages, wearing down enemy formations and morale. Communication and discipline were keys to survival in the chaos of battle. But even the best archers could not be bulletproof. Once enemies closed the distance, archers were vulnerable without heavy armor or cavalry support. Many met grim fates once their arrows ran out, or if caught off guard. Still, the psychological effect of an arrow storm was undeniable, breaking enemy ranks, demoralizing foes, and shaping the landscape of medieval conflict with terrifying efficiency. In short, the medieval archer was not just a foot soldier. They were a living weapon system, a storm of death spun from wood, steel, and bone-hardened resolve. Their arrows didn't just fly, they ruled the battlefield, turning tides and rewriting history with every deadly shot. Medieval archers didn't just shoot arrows, they carved history with them. Two battles stand out dramatically to show how these deadly marksmen shaped kingdoms and empires with precision, pain, and strategy. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. First up, Agincourt. It's widely known as the ultimate triumph of the English longbowmen. Outnumbered and exhausted, the English army faced a superior French force filled with heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. The terrain was unforgiving, muddy fields that would become a nightmare for heavily clad cavalry. English archers, often mocked in stories as mere peasants, unleashed a relentless storm of arrows that turned the French charge into a catastrophe. Horses were felled, knights immobilized, and formations broken before sword met shield. The sheer volume and accuracy of those longbows rewrote battle tactics and left a legacy of awe and fear of the English archers' might. But let's not forget Portugal's own epic moment at Aljubarrota. Here the story is even more interesting because it wasn't just Portuguese archers at work. About 200 English longbowmen, veterans from the battles of the 100 Years' War, stood shoulder to shoulder with Portuguese troops under King João I and the legendary Nuno Álvares Pereira. Positioned on the right flank, these archers expertly utilized their bows to rain down arrows on the invading Franco-Castilian forces. Their role wasn't just supportive, it was decisive. The constant arrow volleys tore through enemy ranks, disrupted cavalry charges, and bought precious time for Portuguese infantry to hold the line. The tactics at Aljubarrota were sophisticated. The English archers didn't just fire blindly. They used coordinated volleys, firing in waves to keep a near-constant barrage. They were protected by stakes and natural terrain, minimizing their exposure to enemy attacks. This strategic use of archers, combined with Portuguese defensive ingenuity, created a deadly trap for the enemy's forces. The victory at Aljubarrota was a turning point in Portuguese history, ensuring their independence from Castile and showcasing the archers' evolving role from mere support to battlefield game-changer. Together, Agincourt and Aljubarrota underline how archers, once seen as foot soldiers or peasants, became central figures on medieval battlefields. Their bows were not only weapons but instruments of strategy, shaping the outcomes of battles and the fate of nations through force, skill, and brutal efficiency. So far, we've talked about foot archers, the grim-faced warriors who stood firm and rained death from a distance. But what if you could combine the power of the bow with the speed of a horse? Enter the mounted archer, a deadly combination of mobility and firepower that terrified medieval battlefields across continents. Mounted archers were no joke. Far from being just messy horsemen waving bows, They were elite fighters who could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. This required years of specialized training, not only in archery, but in horsemanship. Imagine trying to control a wild horse, maintain balance and draw a bowstring heavy enough to pierce armor, all at once. These warriors were some of the most agile and lethal in history. The most famous of these mobile archers were the Mongols. Their empire stretched across vast terrains, and their mounted archers were key to their conquests. Using powerful composite bows made of wood, horn and sinew, Mongol archers could shoot arrows around 300 yards with devastating force. Their bows were smaller but packed an incredible punch, perfect for shooting from horseback. Mounted archers used unique tactics. Instead of a straightforward charge, they employed the famous hit-and-run and feigned retreat maneuvers. They would shoot volleys of arrows while staying out of enemy reach, then suddenly sprint away, luring enemies into traps or chasing down fleeing foes with brutal precision. This fluid style of warfare was almost impossible to counter with traditional heavy cavalry or infantry. Europe also saw its share of mounted archers, though not in the sheer numbers or mastery of the Mongols. Light cavalry units sometimes carried bows or crossbows, offering more tactical flexibility. Still, the composite bow technology and mounted archery were less developed compared to Asia, partly due to different cultural and military traditions. The composite bow itself was a marvel. Unlike the longbow's single piece of yew wood, the composite bow was constructed using multiple layers of materials glued under tension. This design allowed for greater power in a shorter, more flexible bow, ideal for mounted use. The combination of compact size and power made it a top choice for horse archers requiring quick, deadly shots. Mounted archers transformed battles by expanding the battlefield's dynamic. Where foot archers could hold lines and create kill zones, mounted archers provided a mobile threat that could strike anywhere, disrupt formations, and sow panic. Their role extended beyond simple marksmanship. They were scouts, harassers, and shock troops all in one. However, this versatility came with trade-offs. Mounted archers wore lighter armor to maintain speed, making them vulnerable in close combat. They relied heavily on their horses' speed and the ability to keep distance. If caught or cornered, they faced grim odds. Despite these risks, the legacy of mounted archers is profound. Their techniques influenced warfare for centuries, contributing to the rise and fall of empires. They were warriors of speed, skill, and terror, blending the art of archery with the freedom of the saddle in a brutal dance of death. By now, it's clear that the life of a medieval archer was no fairy tale. Beyond the battlefield, the scars, both visible and hidden, told a grim story of sacrifice, suffering, and survival against brutal odds. First, the physical deformities were almost inevitable. Years of pulling bows with draw weights upwards of 150 pounds reshaped bones and muscles in dramatic ways. One arm, usually the drawing arm, became disproportionately larger and stronger, with shoulders sloping unevenly from constant strain. Fingers were hardened to an almost grotesque degree, covered in thick calluses that sometimes cracked and bled. But it wasn't just muscle and bone. Chronic pain and injuries haunted archers through their lives. Shoulder dislocations, tendinitis, and repetitive strain injuries were common. Many dealt with partial loss of mobility, a steep price for their deadly skill. The dangers of battle added another layer of trauma. The constant risk of injury, maiming, or death was a heavy psychological burden. Unlike knights who might expect honor in combat, many archers were expendable, cannon fodder in a hail of arrows and arrows thrown by others. Some archers even resorted to desperate measures. Historical accounts mention soldiers mutilating their own fingers or limbs just to avoid conscription, a grim testament to the horrors they faced. The truth was brutal. This was no glamorous path. Yet despite, or perhaps because of these hardships, medieval archers forged a lasting legacy. Their pain fueled the downfall of powerful knights and shaped entire wars by breaking walls of steel with wooden shafts. The archer's legend is a paradox, brutal, painful, but undeniably pivotal. Their stories remind us that history's heroes often carried invisible burdens, endured savage realities, and redefined what strength and sacrifice truly meant. The next time you hear of an arrow flying true, remember the blood, sweat, and unyielding spirit behind it. So you want to know how to survive and or at least try as a medieval archer? Well, after endless pain, grueling training, brutal battles, and a lifetime of scars, survival was no small feat. These archers endured physical torment that would break most warriors, suffocating conditions in camp, starvation, disease, and the ever-present fear of death on fields soaked with blood and arrows. Yet, despite all odds, these warriors were pivotal. Their mastery of the bow rewrote medieval warfare, turning tides in famous battles like Agincourt and Aljubarrota. From the stiff and twisted arms shaped by years of drawing heavy bows to the seasoned eye that could pick out targets hundreds of yards away, medieval archers were forces of nature, a blend of human endurance, skill, and deadly precision. Their legacy still echoes through history and culture. The longbow and composite bow became icons of tactical innovation, inspiring folklore heroes and shaping military strategy for centuries. But beyond the legends lies the reality of sheer human grit and suffering, of men who were both weapons and warriors, caught in an unforgiving world where survival was the ultimate victory. As we wrap up this descent into the brutal life of medieval archers, remember, behind every arrow that flew was a story of sacrifice, hardship, and a spirit that refused to break. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval crazy history, hit subscribe and stay tuned for more wild, brutal, and fascinating tales from the past. And always watch your back. You never know where the next arrow will come from.